Good morning, everyone. How are you? I'm Larry Porcelli. If you haven't met me before, also known as Lorenzo Porcelli, or if you come to the beach, I'm known as the Lair Dog. Thank you for coming today, President of Southern California Writers Association. And if you haven't been here before, you have joined a group of the wittiest, most clever, intelligent people on the face of the earth. So count yourself blessed. Also on the fringes are thugs, murderers, thieves, pillagers, philanderers. Those people are at the touch of our fingertips, all of the characters of our books. So you've joined a good group. We're a wonderful group of people, the good side and the bad side. There's two sides of every coin. Well, we're so great today. We have such a wonderful speaker in Karen Dionne. And Karen has a phenomenal bestseller that has been out a year or two. Called The Marsh King's Daughter, and it became so popular. It's been translated into, I believe, what is it, 20 languages? More than 20.
25. Actually, we just
25.
sold Croatian last week, so that makes it 26 now.
Have you read any of those in Croatian?
No.
It's probably interesting to see your work translated like that, you know, but 25 languages. And the New York Times said, it's as good as a thriller can be. And it is. And her new book that just came out, isn't that right? What's the name of it?
The Wicked Sister.
The Wicked Sister. I thought in reading some reviews of it, one of the best words I saw was it was unputdownable. And I thought, what a great word. You know, it says it all right there. And one of our members, I got to see if she said she's coming today. I'll find her for you later, wrote a great review of that one. And, but she's just such a great writer and sharing today what brought one to success and one not. She also had a book out called The Killing, an Uncommon Denominator. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
And that had a female detective, Sarah Linden, who Olivia Benson looked like a child next to her, you know, from SVU. So it's just, she writes great thrillers, and they take place so far out in the wild in Michigan. And she's a photographer that loves it there and has grown up there. She's homesteaded up there. She's a nature photographer, and she integrates both the good side of nature and the brutal side of nature, you know, into her work. And it's not for the timid of heart, or it is for the timid of heart if you like to get scared, because you will be on the edge of your seats reading this work. So she has some great, she head of the board, she was on the board of directors for the International Thriller Writers Association, the Bahamas Writers Retreat, and Backspace Writers of New York. So ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome Karen right now, Karen Dionne.
Hello. Yeah, well, that's fun to see the hands up. I'm really happy to be here. I was thrilled to be invited because, as I was telling Diana and Maddie and Larry before everyone came on, I feel like I have my writing journey has been a journey, and I've been helped so much by other people that I just welcome an opportunity to share some of the things that I learned. And so that's the focus of my presentation today, is the 6 things that I learned from writing my Breakout book. So I've got the screen share going on here. Let me see if I can get it in 2 clicks. Is it going to come in? It says I'm sharing. What am I seeing? Oh, I wanted to do this so slick and neatly. Let me try again. Screen share. This one. Oh, come on. We tested this beforehand, didn't we? Is it just me? Are you seeing the title slide?
We're seeing the gallery, all the people on the thumbnails.
Yeah, okay. Let me try one more time. I'll get it right.
Would you like me to sing something to take the pressure off you? Oh, there you go.
I just threw my whole credibility into doubt, didn't I? All right, this is what we want. So I want to share the 6 things that I learned from writing my breakout book. And Larry already touched on something, but just a little bit of my writing history. So I've written The Marsh King's Daughter, my breakout book, was my 4th published novel. These are my other novels. Freezing Point and Boiling Point were science-based thrillers, similar to what Michael Crichton writes. And then I wrote the television tie-in novel, The Killing, in 2014. Freezing Point and Boiling Point were published with Berkeley. So, that was a major publisher, but they came out in mass market paperback size. So, they were available in grocery stores and drugstores and, bookstores, and that was really cool. But sales for Freezing Point were soft. And so my publisher dropped me after Boiling Point came out. The television tie-in novel, if those of you are familiar with the business, it might sound glamorous. I was hired through a publisher by Fox to write an original story using their characters from the television show The Killing, which was, at that time, I believe it was airing on AMC, and now it's available on Netflix. But it's work for hire. So I was paid a flat fee for my work, and I don't own the copyright to it. At the same time that I was writing those novels, I also got very involved with Writers Online. I started an online writers organization called Backspace. We had discussion forums. We had how to write and how to get published articles. As an offshoot of that, I organized conferences for writers in New York for roughly a dozen years. We had an online conference. Towards the tail end of our run, I was approached by the owner of a private island in the Bahamas and asked if I would organize and run a week-long retreat for writers on her island. And I'm like, let me think about that. Okay. And I purposely made this screen a jumble because what was happening, and I didn't quite realize it at the time, was that I had gotten so involved around the edges of writing. As Larry mentioned, I was also on the board of directors of the International Thriller Writers and managing editor of their monthly publication while I'm doing all these things connected with Backspace. And I happened to note, so the important part, I almost skipped over this. There were a lot of times as I was in this point in my life that I often thought about quitting writing, because I thought, well, I've had a couple novels published. Maybe this is as good as it's going to get. Maybe I should just concentrate instead on conference organizing. But in the lead up to my 2013 conference in New York, I happened to notice that an author who had gotten her literary agent at one of my previous conferences was coming out with her subsequent novel. And I hadn't written anything. And I just thought, no, I'm not done yet. I haven't reached my publishing goals. So my business partner and I decided that would be the last conference. And I went off the board of directors a year early. And it wasn't too long after that I got the idea for The Marsh King's Daughter. I put this up on the screen like this because The Marsh King's Daughter is my first novel that came out both in hardcover and in paperback. So, that was really exciting because a novel in hardcover has a better chance of being reviewed in major newspapers. And, it just shows booksellers too that the publisher is really behind this book because they're bringing it out initially in a more expensive edition. The Marsh King's Daughter, just briefly, it tells the story of a young woman who, for the first 12 years of her life, she lives in a cabin surrounded by swamp or marsh in Michigan's Upper Peninsula wilderness. And during all that time, she never sees another person except her mother and father, which might sound grim, but she loves her life. She's a little tomboy, so she likes the hunting and fishing and foraging. She finds out that at the age of 12, the reason they live like that is because her father kidnapped her mother when her mother was a teenager, and she's the product of that crime. And so that's half the story. In the modern day or present day part of the story, Helena is a young mother of 2 little girls. She's living still in the Upper Peninsula. Her father has been in prison for 13 years because of circumstances that she was involved in. So she's the one who put him in prison. Her husband, however, doesn't know her history because there was a lot of notoriety when she and her mother left the marsh, and she just wanted to put all that behind her. So by the time she met him, she was using another name and had changed her looks and so forth. Well, her father escapes from the maximum security prison during a prison transfer, kills 2 guards, disappears into the marsh or the swamp in the Upper Peninsula. So the police can't find him, and Helena knows that he's coming for her. So she has to use the hunting and tracking skills that he taught her as a child to find him before he can find her. So, the 2 stories are interwoven. You've got the cat and mouse game in the present and so forth. When my literary agent sent The Marsh King's Daughter to publishers to see if anyone wanted to buy it, he sent the manuscript to 36 editors on a Monday. And by Tuesday morning, he had heard back from 29 of them. And by Wednesday of that week, we had our first offer. It was a preempt, which is, if you're not familiar with the term, it's a publisher's attempt. They offer a high amount, hoping to prevent the book from going to auction. Didn't work. The book went to auction the next week, and we had 12 publishers bid on it. So it was a 12-way auction. And that was just for US rights. Immediately after the book sold in a 7-way auction in the UK, a 5-way auction in Germany, a 3-way auction in Korea, for a record amount in Poland, and as we've already said, altogether in 25 languages around the world, which is pretty astonishing. And I just love this screen because it's so fun to see the covers, and how the publishers in the various countries have interpreted Helena's story for their particular audience. After The Marsh King's Daughter began to be published in these other countries, people would send me photos from that country. So my Dutch publisher apparently bought a lot of these posters all over major cities. And someone sent me this picture from Poland. I think it's a truck stop because, you can see a little bit of a map off to the side there, and it looks like it's the audio book. I don't read Polish, but I'm pretty sure I know what bestseller means. So, that was fun. And then it just kept getting crazier and crazier. A friend was walking down the street in Barcelona, Spain, and she passed Spain's biggest bookstore and saw this. And, my goodness, that window display, I'm pretty sure that poster is as tall as I am. And, then of course, a nice amount of copies of the book on the table inside. The Marsh King's Daughter also was selected for a special promotion in Sweden when it came out in paperback there. Apparently Sweden has one major chain of stores that's all the way from big box stores down to little mom and pop stores. And so, when they chose the book for their pick of the month, not only was it discounted, but it got a lot of exposure. Like this. And you're welcome to, just shake your head and laugh, because I do. I look at that picture on the left and I think, well, gosh, the other books don't even have a chance. Someone walks in and thinks, what book should I buy? Oh, maybe this one. And then likewise in the picture on the right, it's just, I enlarged it on my touchpad, and I'm pretty sure there were about 100 copies on that display. So unsurprisingly, The Marsh King's Daughter in paperback in Sweden did hit #1 on their bestseller list. So that was, of course, a very exciting moment for me. The Marsh King's Daughter was also on the bestseller list in Germany for 18 weeks and in Iceland for 2 months. That's it at the bottom there, #8, Dr. I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Some other fun things happened for me as a result of the book. My UK publisher brought me over to London to do some signings there. And my Norwegian publisher brought me over to Oslo at the beginning of the year to do what's called Krimfestivalen. So here's me on the stage with Claire McIntosh. I'm sure some of you know her. So that was, of course, very fun too. By the way, I learned something here. If you're ever on the stage, don't wear white, because, it looks like you're glowing. I learned that the hard way. More than the bestsellerness, which is, of course, very exciting, The Marsh King's Daughter started racking up a lot of awards and honors. And I'm sure you can understand that as a writer, that almost meant more to me than a lot of sales, because we all know that books can have be bestsellers, and they're not particularly well written, right? You know, they strike a chord for some other reason. So the Library of Michigan chose Marsh King's Daughter as one of their Michigan notable books. It won the Barry Award and the Crimson Scribe Award, which, if you're familiar with how this works in the mystery world, these are pretty big awards. Like the Crimson Scribe Award, the Suspense magazine gives their best of the year in 11 categories, all the way from cozy mystery up to horror. And then of those 11, they choose one book to give the Crimson Scribe Award as like the best book overall that year. And that was my book. Astonishing. The Barry Award was interesting to me too, because look at my fellow nominees. These are all established New York Times bestselling authors. And then here's me in there with my new novel, you know, that nobody had heard of me, nobody had heard of the Marsh King's Daughter. And then, you know, it did win. So that, again, was pretty astonishing. Larry's already mentioned the Marsh King's Daughter was also reviewed in the New York Times. I knew that the book was going to be reviewed as part of a thriller roundup, but I was imagining it would be the last book mentioned. Maybe there would be just something that we could use as a pull quote, like exciting. But instead it was the opening story, and or, you know, the opening book featured as part of the article, and it was a rave review right across the board. So, you know, that was definitely my kill me now moment, because it had been a pretty wild ride up to this point, but, you know, that's the apex. You know, a rave review in the New York Times doesn't get better than that. Except maybe it does, because the Marsh King's Daughter has also been optioned, you know, as a major motion picture. This has been in the works now for a couple of years, and I'm sure that you LA people know a lot more about this aspect of the business than I do. The Marsh King's Daughter, in that 2-year period, has had 2 actresses associated with the project and 4 directors, but this is where we currently stand right now. And of course, because of the shutdowns, you know, nothing happened all spring, but Black Bear Pictures, which is financing it, the project, recently extended the option. And then even more exciting to me, because I tracked this on IMDb, just in the last 3 weeks, the casting director signed on. And I thought, they wouldn't bring in a casting director unless there was something for them to do, right? So, you know, fingers crossed that this will come about. So the reason I show all that, I hope you don't take it as boastful. I want you to take away the idea of don't quit, because, you know, if I had quit when I was discouraged, when I thought, oh, my career isn't going anywhere, this is as good as it's going to be, these would be my 3 novels, and I would have had no idea of what was all that stuff that was just around the corner for me would never have happened. So absolutely, you know, whatever your goals are, don't quit. I also spent a lot of time asking myself why the reception for The Marsh King's Daughter was so different than my other books. You would have to take all my previous publishing experience, combine it, and supersize it to equal a fraction of what happened for The Marsh King's Daughter. So I have actually isolated these 6 points. And I should have mentioned this before we even met, but I do have a handout that summarizes these 6 points in a little more detail, and I'm happy to send that on afterwards, so you don't have to be frantically taking notes if you'd rather not. So these are the 6 things that I isolated. I started with character. I challenged myself to explore new writing techniques, listened to my gut, dove into the characters' emotions, focused on universal themes, and offered a fresh take on a familiar story. So I'm going to unpack these just a little bit briefly. When I say started with character, I did. My early novels, Freezing Point and Boiling Point, began with plot. What would happen if, you know, and it was situational. And then I created characters to serve the plot. But for The Marsh King's Daughter, I actually woke up with these sentences fully formed in my head. I wasn't dreaming about the character. The sentences were just there. And as you can see, if I told you my mother's name, you'd recognize it right away. My mother was famous, though she never wanted to be. Hers wasn't the kind of fame anyone would wish for. J.C. Dugard, Amanda Berry, Elizabeth Smart, that kind of thing, though my mother was none of them. And so, in the middle of the night, I thought, well, this is interesting. So this character is the daughter of a kidnapped girl and the man who took her. In the morning, surprise, it still looked like a good idea. So I wrote up a few additional paragraphs in the character's voice saying a little bit more about who she is. And these sentences and those paragraphs are now the first page of the novels, which is really cool. So while I didn't sit down and think, oh, I'm going to start with a character, it just happened. My advice is give thought to doing that, because if you do, for one thing, your character is less likely to be a stereotype because you're creating a unique character. You may not even know what the story is going to be. I didn't, and I just began with the character. Another advantage is then the character shapes the story. So, it's like you're not trying to fit or adjust the character to fit your plot. The character shapes the story, and that makes for a stronger story. When I say the character's backstory becomes the front story, by that I mean that, again, they are central to the whole book. So anything that happened to them before becomes an important part of the story itself. Another, I think, really important thing was I tried a lot of writing techniques that were new to me. The thing is, The Marsh King's Daughter was a departure from what I'd been writing. And in order to tell Helena's story, I had to raise my game, if you want to, use that phrase. So, for instance, I've already mentioned how The Marsh King's Daughter is told in 2 timelines, past and present. I had never done that before. There are a lot of tense shifts. There are a lot of flashbacks. In fact, in one of the early readers, David Morrell, if you all know him as the creator of the character Rambo, he said, God knows how many flashbacks. And it's true. I even snuck a flashback in the final climactic scene, which pleases me no end, because, you're not supposed to be able to do that, but I did. Another thing I had never done before was directly addressing the reader. If I told you my mother's name, you'd recognize it right away. I'd never done that before. And while I didn't mention, The Marsh King's Daughter has a fairy tale element, a big piece of the book, because that's the name of a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. And I used that fairy tale to structure the story. So how was I going to bring that into the book? I didn't know. Another thing that I did, which I felt was risky, was 3/4 of the way through the book, I introduced 2 imaginary characters. And again, as I did that, I was like, can I do that? I don't know. So I was so outside my comfort zone writing this story, trying all these new to me things, that when the first chapter was done, I wasn't even sure if it was working. And I sent it to my agent, and he loved it. He told me much later that it was so good, he did not think I had written it. Which is okay. He's been my agent for 21 years. We can talk like that. But I use that to show how I really did step up my game. So this is why taking risks matter. If at the beginning, of course, a beginner has to follow the rules because, they're just learning. But if you don't break the rules and you don't try something risky, you'll never know what you are capable of. Basically, by pushing myself, I found out that I'm a better writer than I realized. So that was, to me, a really big learning point as well. Another aspect to my experience, when I got the idea for The Marsh King's Daughter, I was working on another novel. In fact, I was looking for a backstory for the character in this other novel. And I think that's why I woke up with the character talking to me in the night. Regardless, I knew right away that this book, The Marsh King's Daughter, had big commercial potential. Not as much as it ended up having, that was beyond my wildest dreams, but I knew that it could be something special. So I set aside the novel that I was working on in favor of The Marsh King's Daughter. So just a few questions, food for thought. Think about the last book you read that you were so impressed by, and then try to analyze why. Why did this book make such a strong impression on you? And then think about the book that you're currently writing, or whatever other project it might be, script, screenplay. I realize there's a variety going on. And ask yourself if this is the book that's going to get that reception. And if some part of you knows that your story isn't quite there yet, then, you've got two choices. You can figure out how to make it amazing, or you can set it aside and start something new. I know that setting it aside might sound drastic, but as it says on the screen there, it takes a year or more to write a novel. So why would a person want to spend all that time writing a good book or even a great book? You want to write a fantastic book that has every chance of breaking out. You really do owe it to yourself not to settle and just write a good book. Another aspect that was unique for me was I dove deeply into the characters' emotions. There were a lot of times when I was writing that I thought I was going over the top, because I'm a very practical, down-to-earth kind of person. And so, writing a really strong emotional content in certain scenes felt awkward. But the result is, kind of speaks for itself. And I think it's interesting that a lot of readers, I read all of the Amazon and Goodreads reviews, a lot of them have said that as they were reading, they thought they were reading a memoir. And so they actually went back to check to see if this was a true story or if it was fiction, which obviously, for a writer is very cool. So the characters have to be real. And we have to dig deeply into the emotion, because if we're not willing to go there, then the reader can't either. I think this is an important thought. I'll just read it off the screen. Big books require larger than life characters put into situations where they have to make impossible choices. And so that's really, really important if you want to write a breakout book. So the point is, of course, that readers care less about what happens in the story and more about who it happens to. So the characters that we write have to touch them on an emotional level. Another thing that helped to set The Marsh King's Daughter apart was that I focused on universal themes. I asked my editor one time why he thought people in such diverse countries, publishers were wanting to publish The Marsh King's Daughter. And he said, it's because at heart, it's a father-daughter story. And so I thought that was a really interesting point. If we can have something at the core of our work that a person can relate to, no matter their circumstances, who they are, where they live, again, then we're going to have a bigger chance of success with that book. Also, a fresh take on a familiar story. The Marsh King's Daughter is told not from the point of view of the kidnap victim, but from her daughters. A few people have said they haven't seen that in fiction. I'm not going to claim that that's the case, but it's rare enough for them to think that they haven't seen it in fiction before, right? So again, take a look at the story that you want to write, and maybe you can skew it a little bit. Maybe the character that you think is going to be the main character, maybe someone else can come to the fore instead, and you can make something really special. Keywords: surprise, fresh, and unexpected. I went to a writer's conference a long time ago, and Jonathan Karp, who is a really major editor in New York, said, novels should be novel. And I liked that. I thought that said a lot. So that's takeaway number 2 that I hope that you will, take to heart from this discussion. Stretch, reach, and grow. Push yourself, and you never know what might happen. The only thing that would have made my personal experience with The Marsh King's Daughter better was if this had been my first novel, because publishers love to break out a debut. My publisher pretends that my other books don't exist, and I call this my first psychological suspense, but we can't truly say it was a debut. So if you're not published, you're in a good spot, because you still have a chance to make that big splashy debut. And if you are published, it's not too late to write a breakout book. As I've shown, my career was only modestly successful until I wrote The Marsh King's Daughter, which was over a span of approximately 20 years. So if you're honest with yourself and you're willing to rework your work and set aside a good book in favor of a great one, there's no reason that you can't be giving a class like this one day too. So I just like to finish off with this quote from George Balanchine. Why are you stingy with yourself? Why are you holding back? What are you saving for? For another time? There are no other times. There is only now, right now. So that's me. And I'm happy to take questions or, anything from this point on.
Okay, well, I'm going to start. I have one question that came to mind when I was listening to you. Coming off of such tremendous success with Marsh King and surprisingly shocking success, how did you approach writing The Wicked Sister? And even though The Marsh King wasn't your first book, The Wicked Sister is almost a sophomore effort after that because it's such a different genre. How did you feel writing that book, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's the thing. Yes, I was sure that I wouldn't have the sophomore slump because, Marsh King wasn't my first novel. But yeah, it was definitely challenging because when all of those good things were happening for the Marsh King's Daughter, of course I was excited. Who wouldn't be? But at the same time, every time something like that happened, the weight on my shoulders just grew heavier and heavier and heavier. My editor, he's very, very smart man. And he told me early on, he gave me a pep talk because Putnam bought 2 books. So I was under contract for the second book. He said, I know that the Marsh King's Daughter is the best book you've ever written, but it's not a fluke. He says, this is who you are. This is how you write. And I'm confident that the next book will be the best book you've ever written. And I was like, thanks, Dad. And then I turned it back on myself and I'm like, oh no, he expects the next book to be better than the Marsh King's Daughter. So I did struggle. I struggled mightily with The Wicked Sister. I was late delivering it because I started over easily 24 times. My editor rejected my pages, first 50 pages 4 times, as he should have. It took me a long time to find the story, to get out of that headspace. Finally, what helped me was recognizing that it wasn't my job to compare the 2 books, that inevitably reviewers would, readers would. But for me, my job was just to write the best version of that book that I possibly could. And so once I got rid of those, editorial voices in my head saying, you can't do this, well, I did it. So here we are.
Wait, and you mentioned the emotional, digging deep into the emotional components of your characters, but part of writing is digging deep into the emotional components of the writer themselves. And I think you touched on a point that I thought was interesting, and maybe I feel personally connected to that because you have so many, at one point you had so many different projects going on that were writing adjacent. Mm-hmm. So when you made the decision to kind of step away and maybe concentrate, what were you hearing and what were you telling yourself in your head? And what was different about approaching writing at that point for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the thing is, when I woke up in the night with those sentences in my head, like I said, I knew that this book had potential. At the time, my husband and I were doing furniture upholstery for a living. And because of lifestyle choices we had made when we were young, we had always been self-employed. So we had no savings, no pension plan, no way for him to ever stop working. And again, I knew that this book had potential. So for a year, I wrote full-time on that book. And I did not help in the upholstery shop. So we actually took a financial loss, right? As I was writing the book on spec. And we've thought that if it sold at this level, meaning the advance that the publisher paid, was this much, that we could just make retirement work. And instead, it sold 10 times what we had hoped. It was pretty amazing. So he officially retired that morning. And into that. So I do think that the luxury of being able to write full time on the book really made a big difference because I could just immerse myself in it. I was also fortunate because Helena came to me as a character fully formed. So there wasn't this exploration period where I was trying to figure out who the character was. I'm not sure if that quite answers your question, but it's close.
It did. And then the follow-up question to that is, when you're trying to dig as a writer and you're trying to dig emotionally or portray a character's deep emotions, what techniques did you use to do that so that people did feel so connected to these characters?
I think it just comes down to being honest on the page. I have a good friend. He got an agent. She couldn't sell his books. I feel as though his books are superficial. He's just not going deep enough. I won't say they're like a caper story, but the difference between a caper and a psychological suspense, they're just a different tone and a different level. So, for instance, in The Marsh King's Daughter, there is a section that goes quite dark, darker than I'm comfortable with as a person. And the problem, I sort of wrote myself into a corner because I knew from the beginning that Helena would leave the marsh by her own choice when she's 12, because there's nothing heroic if she and her mother are just found and rescued and plucked out of that situation. She had to choose to leave. And because she loved her father so exclusively up to that point, because she had no one else in her life, she would have to see him very clearly as a bad man. It wouldn't be enough for just someone to say, "Oh, your dad's a bad man." She wouldn't act on that. She had to see it. So the story goes very dark at that point. And so I think that goes back to the honesty about writing the emotional quality into the book. I didn't want to write that scene, but I had to. So, it's like that. I think as writers, we would recognize if we're holding back. I think we're smart enough to tell. So just, go full out. Don't worry about, maybe it sounds over the top or silly. Hey, you can always dial it back. But, it has to be there on the page to start with.
So when you were writing those scenes, those dark scenes, once you gave yourself permission to write them, were they easy or were they still difficult that you had to keep rewriting?
No, they were easy. I think there's a dark side in me too.
The floodgates opened.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, like, Helena's father in The Marsh King's Daughter is a very bad man, kidnapper, rapist, murderer. But you guys know this, as a writer, I don't think of him as a bad man when I'm writing his scenes, because I'm enough in his head that I understand why he makes the choices that he does and why he does the things that he does. So, it's a little bit like method acting, right? You become the character that you're putting on the page. So I didn't even think of it as being dark, as I was writing it. One part of me knew it was, one part of me worried, that people would think less of me because of that. And in fact, my middle daughter, who read The Marsh King's Daughter, she liked it, but she said it really creeped her out that her mother thought of those things.
She probably never looked at you the same way.
I don't think so. I wonder why people are at a distance from me now.
And I think also, and we'll get to everybody's questions in the chat, but you were talking about using all those different techniques for the first time. I mean, The Marsh King was such a suspenseful novel. I mean, everything about it, from the premise, there was foreshadowing and foreboding all the way through the book. How did you structure writing that? And you talked about dual timelines and shifting tense, and you had a lot of characters taking front stage. How did you structure writing that book?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too, because I originally conceived the novel as a dual timeline. And so when I started writing, for the first time, this was my first experience with a character almost talking to me. And so my agent kept pushing for an outline. He wanted to see where the story was going to go. And I didn't want to give him an outline because I was afraid it would make the character be quiet. But then eventually the story grew too big for me to hold it all in my head. So I wrote an outline. So I wrote the outline chronologically, from childhood all the way up to adulthood. And when I sent that to my agent, he called me out on it, and he said, well, what happened to this dual timeline thing? And the thing is, if I had told the story chronologically, so it would have been, Helena growing up, she's 12, this big dramatic thing happens when she and her mother leave the marsh. Then the momentum of the story would have fallen off and climbed again back to that point where she's hunting her father as a young woman. So by interweaving the two halves of the story, then the two climaxes fall together at the end of the book. So that of course makes a lot more sense. So, from that point on, I worked from the outline. My outlines are just maybe 8-10 pages of single spaced, with a space between paragraphs. So there's not a lot there, because I love the process of discovery, as we're writing, and something comes to mind, and maybe you've laid the groundwork for it, but you didn't realize that's where the story was taking you. So, I'm able to do both things. I certainly didn't sit down at the beginning and think I'll add these imaginary characters later on in the book. They just showed up.
Was that the biggest surprise to you when you were writing the book? Was the appearance of these magical characters, or was there something else that surprised you when you were?
Yeah, I that probably was the biggest surprise, because here's what happens, and this isn't giving too much away of the story. So Helena, when she's 12, her father takes her to Tequamanon Falls, which is a major waterfall in the Upper Peninsula. And there's a viewing platform on one side, and she and her father are on the other side, hiding more or less. And he takes her there because at 12, she's starting to get restless. She knows all along there's a bigger world out there. And it's not that she doesn't like the marsh, but she just wants to see more. And he recognizes that. So he's going to show her the marsh's greatest treasure, to kind of anchor her to the marsh. Instead, while they're there, she sees people on the other side. She sees a family, a father and mother and 2 kids. And this is the first time she's seen people ever in her life, other than her mother and father. So as I was writing the follow-up chapter to that, I thought, well, this how big of an impression did this make on her? Huge, right? And so, that chapter starts, for days I couldn't stop thinking about those kids. And then because she has a big imagination, she starts giving them qualities, and she creates them as imaginary characters. She keeps it up because it annoys her father, because again, she's that age, she's 12. But what happens is they become more and more real to her, and in the trauma of making the decision to leave the marsh, and what she sees her father doing and so forth, they start speaking to her as if they were real. And so what it is it's almost like a psychotic break. And her father is not a nice man. At one point, he puts her in a well for punishment because she wouldn't shoot a wolf. And in the well, it's cold. She's starving. She's maybe dying. And one of those imaginary characters says to her, "Your father doesn't love you," which I think is a really powerful moment. So it's her subconscious, recognizing that her father doesn't love her, but she's not yet ready to admit that out loud. So these characters end up serving a really critical purpose. And again, they just appeared. So I'm pretty proud of that part of the book.
I was inspired, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. I want to make sure we do get to these questions in the chat. And also we've got some, comments. Number one is everybody would like to go to the Bahamas for that writing conference.
Oh, isn't that the truth? I'll tell you, I could get any faculty member I wanted. Lee Child was on the last one, and so I can genuinely say I've spent a week in the Bahamas with Lee.
Oh.
It was nice.
It was nice. Well, we'll see what your review is on Amazon of that weekend with Lee Child.
Yeah.
Okay. So Christine would like to know, did you submit your books for the awards that you received?
Well, my publisher did that for me. Yeah. So that's how it works. When you're with the major publisher, they'll take care of that sort of thing for you. So that was nice.
And then Larry says, Amy Kaufman is tops. Many top actors look to her for great roles. We've got our movie business coming in here. Thanks, Larry. Okay, and Richard Morgan, in your novels from 2008 to 2017, your scene setting changes. How well do you know Upper Michigan?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So I was setting those early books in places that I thought were exotic. Antarctica, the first book is set in Antarctica, and I lived in Michigan's Upper Peninsula for 30 years, so I felt like I could write with authority about ice and snow and cold, right? And then the next book was set at Chaitan Volcano in northern Patagonia, Chile, where I went for on-site research, and that was a really cool trip and so forth. And so I do think it's interesting because in the morning when I was after I got the idea for The Marsh King's Daughter and I was writing up those paragraphs, I almost gave the book an urban setting because I was thinking about the young women in Cleveland who were hidden away in plain sight for so long. And, you know, as a writer, you think, how can this be? How did nobody notice what was happening in that house? But at the last minute, I changed it to the setting that I did, a cabin on a ridge surrounded by swamp in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, because I lived there for 30 years. My husband and I homesteaded in the 1970s. We bought a piece of property in the Upper Peninsula. We were city kids, you know, part of the Back to the Land movement. We lived in a tent while we built our little cabin. Our daughter was 6 weeks old when we moved to this tent and spent the summer there. We carried water from a stream. We sampled wild foods. So I ended up drawing heavily on those experiences when I wrote The Marsh King's Daughter. And I realized there were so many times when I would include a detail having to do with the natural world, and I would think to myself, I never would have found this no matter how much I researched, because I just knew it. And in fact, the New York Times reviewer singled that out as one of the things that makes the book so superb, his words, was the authenticity of the setting. And he said, you can tell when the author describes things having to do with the natural world that her knowledge goes deeper than Wikipedia. And so now, you know, to finish out that thought, I was searching for exotic settings around the world. You know, I found the exotic setting basically in my backyard because, you know, when somebody in Turkey or Korea or, you know, wherever reads my novel, they think, ooh, what an exotic setting. So I just thought that was a really interesting experience. And it's perhaps something that, you know, other writers can take away too. Don't overlook what you know well.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and he's got a follow-up question is, what were the nuts and bolts of your change when you changed from the types of novels you were originally writing to The Marsh King? So what were the nuts and bolts of your change? Did you read more, write more, interact with other writers, all of them? What brought you to that change?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't think I've been asked that before. When I started writing The Marsh King's Daughter, I did not even know if it was going to be a thriller. I didn't know what it was going to be, but all I knew was I wanted to write that story. And I think starting with a clean slate like that was really freeing, because then I could follow the story where it needed to go, you know, and throw in those imaginary characters when I needed them and so forth. So I wasn't bound by any constraints. And I have heard other writers say that too. You know, Wendy Walker, her Breakout book, I guess it's written in an epistolary kind of way, and she came from writing romance to psychological suspense, and she had not read a lot of psychological suspense, so she came at it, you know, with a fresh take, and it ended up going really well for her. So, you know, certainly there's nothing wrong with reading in your genre, and I do take inspiration from stories that are really well written in my genre. But if you want to make your own mark, you know, not just write.
Okay, great. And then Kara said her question was, what was your draft editing process like? Do you have any tips for how you review book drafts?
Yeah, so my first drafts tend to be spare because I'm a very impatient person and I'm in a hurry to get the story down. So I've come to accept that. I'm also a perfectionist, you know, so it's really hard for me to let go of something before it's perfect, you know, well knowing that I might be changing it or fixing it later. So I write my first drafts by hand. And I have learned that for me, it's a lot more productive than writing on the computer, partly because that tendency to go back and fix and tweak, you know, can't be indulged on when you're writing on paper, or you wouldn't even be able to read it. Also because my handwriting is really terrible. And so I have to force myself to slow down as I write if I'm going to be able to read it later. And so the process of doing that, I think, makes me give a little more thought to writing. When I made that change, I went from 2,500 words a week to 3,000 to 5,000 words a day. So as I say, it was extraordinarily more productive. It was forced on me by circumstances when I was writing that killing novel, but now I do that. And so then I write a chapter, And I like to see the word count grow. So, you know, after I've written a chapter by hand, I type it in the computer and then give it just a very light edit, but then just go back to paper. And for me, that works. It helps me to get past those perfectionist tendencies and you know, make decent progress on the book.
Yeah, that's outrageous. That's
Yeah.
fantastic. I mean, that's an amazing. Maddie, you're yeah. There you go.
Okay, so we've got a question from Larry. What prompted you to begin writing, and how did you deal with rejections? Let's see, and a book or two with a lesser audience. Okay, how did you deal with the rejections and maybe the expectations that weren't quite what you thought?
Yeah, so I began writing seriously about 20 years ago, and I was inspired by my son's experience. I won creative writing awards when I was in high school, but I did other creative things like build that cabin, and I did stained glass and fiber arts and just a variety of things. When my son was in high school, we were living in Michigan's Upper Peninsula in a little town. He's a good writer, so I was encouraging him to enter the same contests I did well in, the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards. He did win a gold key, so it turned out to be the contest's 75th year anniversary. So the awards ceremony for all the kids that won these gold and silver key awards was at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. Kathy Bates was the master of ceremonies. Frank McCourt, who wrote Angela's Ashes, was the keynote speaker. And I'm like, we are going. And so for me, that was the moment where I said, well, you know, what about me? I used to be a good writer. So I spent about a year writing short stories to get the creative juices flowing. Then I decided I was going to write a novel. I wrote a novel in 3 months. And then I was like, okay, now I need a literary agent because I'm going to be published with a major publisher. So I started querying with a first draft, which is, you know, horrendous. I even queried agents who were scammers, I found out later. And so I didn't know anything about the process. My agent signed me about 9 months later, even though he felt the novel was not anywhere near ready to go out because he loved the premise and he thought my writing was strong enough to pull it off with a rewrite. We worked on that novel together for 3.5 years through 3 complete rewrites before, you know, we were so sick of working on it. He sent it out and we didn't get a sale. And then the novel that I had started during my agent search, that was Freezing Point, and that was the first published novel. As far as rejections are concerned, I do think it's kind of funny because the very first rejection we got from an editor for Freezing Point was from Mark Tavani, who was at that time with Ballantine. Well, Mark Tavani is my editor today at Putnam. So isn't that cool? I mean, you know, rejections mean nothing. All they mean is you're in the game, you know, you just have to keep going.
Okay, great that you're trying. Okay, so let's see our next one. Okay, Tanya says she loves the painting behind you.
Oh, thank you. That's a photograph from Michigan's Upper Peninsula, birch trees.
Okay, so the other is Richard. Richard, you're getting good questions today. In your opinion, would Gone Girl and the Marsh King's Daughter have a similar approach?
Yes and no. The thing about the Marsh King's Daughter, which I think is a little unusual, is all of what I told you about the storyline is basically on the first page. You know, the introduction, the reader already knows that Helena was rescued or left the marsh and so forth. And so I give away a lot at the beginning. And then the question of the book becomes not so much what's going to happen or who, but how did it happen? How did we get to this point? And I think Gone Girl, with that big twist or reveal halfway through, is very cool. I love the book, and I love the ending. I know not everybody did. So you know, it's definitely a model. And actually, the novel that I'm working on now, I'm holding something back, which I hope to reveal at the very end of the book. So we'll see if it works.
Ooh. Okay, so now we're going to buy Marsh, the Marsh King, Wicked Sister, and your next book. Okay, so we have that.
That's good.
All right. And let's see, we have from Frank Prey. How did you adjust to shifting from the daily routine of upholstery work to writing full-time? Did you have any joy, resistance, fear, procrastination, etc. responses?
Yeah, it was I was just really happy that my husband could stop working, because upholstery is a fairly physical job. The year that I was writing The Marsh King's Daughter, that was a little stressful. He supported me in that, but we were not putting out as much output because I wasn't helping him in the shop. And then he also, my mother lived with us at the time, my elderly mother. So, he's taking her to all of her doctor appointments, and he was cooking all the meals. So I would get a text saying, supper's ready. And I'd go and I'd eat and I'd go back to work again. So, it was a big investment really on both of our part. But the day the novel sold, and, that it sold so well, the 2-book deal, it's not a huge secret. It's out there on the net. It was 7 figures.
Wow.
So that was real easy to get used to.
Yeah,
and that enabled me then to stop, work, and him stop work. And then now I became a writer. Yeah.
Well, that's such an interesting thing. And I know, Frank, we were talking about how you balance writing with your passion with your vocation and avocation. So how did you handle the pressure of that? That was a big risk. That personally and professionally, because of your husband and your mother and feeling that. How did you manage the guilt and the pressure? How did you compartmentalize that when you were writing?
It's funny. I'm thinking back on those days because I just remember it as a joyful time.
Well, that's good. Okay, then don't think about that.
Yeah, I'm sure there was guilt and I'm sure there was stress, but And had my husband been, let's say, opposed to the idea, obviously, that would have been a different situation entirely. In fact, after that first novel that I told you about did not sell, he thought I was going to stop writing. He thought that would be the end of it. And I was like, no, I came really close. I have an agent. I need to try this again, So, and when that novel then sold, then, he could view my work in a different way because I'm being paid for it. And I do think, for myself, that makes a big difference. I think if I was writing just, for the joy of writing and for self-fulfillment, then to me, that does feel as though I would have been selfish. But, I was writing with a financial goal in view, and it panned out. So that worked out okay. I mean, obviously I write for the joy of writing too, but that doesn't put food on the table.
Right. Okay. Okay. And Christina wants to know what inspired you about Wicked Sister.
Okay, yeah. So The Wicked Sister is also told in 2 timelines, this time by 2 different characters. So we have Rachel in the opening, the present day, and then her mother in the past. And what's fun about this is the reader finds out on the first page of Rachel's story that she's in a mental hospital because she believes that she killed her mother. She's responsible for this terrible shooting accident that took both her parents' lives when she was 11. And so she's consumed with the guilt caused by that, and has been living there by her own choice, figuring that's all she deserves. She doesn't deserve a better life than that. And then, so again, telling Jenny's story, her mother's story in the past, again, first person present tense, I thought to myself, can I do this? Because the reader knows that this character is dead, will they invest in a character that they know is dead when the book opens? But obviously that works too. So, and both halves of the story were inspired by an aspect of something out of my personal life. The character of Rachel, of course, we know there are accidental shootings all the time, right? So a lot of years ago, I had read about a toddler who was strapped into his car seat behind his mother in the car, and he found a loaded handgun in her purse, and he accidentally shot and killed her through the seat. And it just stuck with me because I thought, at some point that little boy is going to find out what he did, as he grows up. It's not going to be hidden forever. And how would that change him? How could you come to terms with that? You grow up, thinking you're a good person, because we all do, right? And then you find out maybe when you're a teenager that you did this terrible thing when you were little. How can you deal with that? So those were the questions I want to explore in Rachel's half of the story. in the mother's half of the story, obviously there's a sister. Rachel has a sister because the book is called The Wicked Sister. And so in that half, I'm working with the idea of how does a parent, a mother in particular, deal with raising a child who has, well, it's no big secret, she's a psychopath. And so, at what point do you say, I need help, this isn't working? And that too was inspired by people I knew. They adopted 3 siblings. The 2 younger children did well in the new environment, but the older child did not. He became violent towards his little brother and sister and just impossible to control. So when he was 12, they had to put him in an institution. And I thought, how do you reach that point where you make that decision? It's almost like Sophie's Choice, right? Choose between your children. So that's what I wanted to explore in Jenny's half of the story. So kind of heavy, deep themes, but there's lighter moments in the book too.
Well, okay, so Sherry has a question. Did you belong to a writer's critique group? And if yes, what did you get out of your experience?
Yeah, I think they're really good for early writers. Not necessarily at the very beginning, because a critique group, as you all probably know, can steer a very new writer wrong, by making comments on their book before they've really found their feet. I had a writing partner for my science-based thrillers who also wrote science-based thrillers. In fact, I ended up with his editor at Berkeley, which I thought was kind of interesting. And it was a nice partnership because he was a medical doctor, he was a neurologist, and his books were based like on his doctoral thesis. And I don't have a degree, so he would read my novels to make sure that the medical aspect and the science was passable, and I would read his for him to make sure that a normal person could understand it. So we worked together for quite a few years, but I have since grown away from using a group. My agent is my first reader, and he's very sharp editorially, as witnessed by what how he helped me before. So yeah, I don't work with a critique group anymore.
Okay, great. Okay, so that was our last question. So where can people find your books, Karen?
Well,
obviously we're all interested.
I do want to, if people are looking to purchase a book, make a plea for buying through an independent bookstore. You can go to indiebound.org and find a local bookstore near you if you don't know of one, or you can find their website and order from them online. Especially because of COVID, bookstores are struggling mightily. They're just barely keeping their heads above water, if that, and a lot of them are going under. So if you're in a position to buy my books, thank you. And, please buy them from an independent bookstore. But library's great too. Readers are readers.
Well, that's great. We have a couple of great independent bookstores locally that people can use. And also, if you can't afford to buy a book, there are other ways to support our authors. One is go to the library, read the book, leave a review. Mm-hmm. Reviews are great and appreciated. If you like the book, share it. Tell your friends. Let them know. Put them on the next list on the library. So there are other ways besides buying a book. So we appreciate it if you support our authors, especially Karen, because thank you for sharing so much of your story and your time and your insights and your experience. We appreciate that.
Well, thank you. It's been great being here. And again, I just hope people take away that if it could happen to me, it could happen to anyone. I hope it happens to all of you because, it's a pretty fun ride.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. And I'm going to turn it over to Larry.
But again, writers, thank you for being here today. If you haven't become a member, please go to our website, southerncalwriters.org. And we think you would be, there's a great $35 special that will take you to the end of this year and all of next year. So please, if you haven't renewed, renew. If you need to, join us. We appreciate, you see, we do this constantly for people to hear and improve your own writing.